والسلام على من لا نبي بعد نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن اقتفى أثره واستنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد, فإنشاءالlah we'll continue with reading from the book known as Tariq al-Islam by Shamsuddin Abu Abdullah Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Uthman adh-Dhahabi rahimahullah ta'ala, who died in the year 748 after the Hijrah. And we are still in the events, the second year of Hijrah, those events that happened after the Battle of Badr. The Battle of Badr, where the Muslims, Allah blessed them with victory over the Kuffar of Quraysh, and that first battle, that decisive battle between the Muslims and the Kuffar. And last time we had left off with the news of the defeat of the Kuffar reaching Quraysh, and how that news reached them, and how they received it. So he mentioned that adh-Dhahabi rahimahullah ta'ala, he said, قال ابن إسحاق وكان أول من قدم مكة بمصاب قريش الحيثمان بن عبد الله الخزاعي فقال ما وراءك؟ فقالوا ما وراءك؟ قال قتل عقبة وشيبة وأبو جهل وأمية وزمعة بن الأسود ونبيه ومنبه وأبو البختري وابن هشام. فلما جعل يعدد أشراف قريش قال صفوان بن أمية وهو قاعد في الحجر والله إن يعقل هذا فاسألوه عني. فقالوا ما فعل صفوان؟ قال ها هو ذاك جالس قد والله رأيت أباه وأخاه حين قتلا. Adh-Dhahabi, he mentions that Ibn Ishaq, right, the person who wrote that famous book Al-Maghazi, Ibn Ishaq, Muhammad ibn Ishaq, he says that Ibn Ishaq, he said that the first person to return to Quraysh with the news, to return to Mecca with the news of the defeat of Quraysh was Al-Haysuman ibn Abdullah al-Khuza'i. And so they said to him, what have you left behind you? Right? Where are you? What's behind you? What did you leave at the battlefield? What's happened? Ma wara'ak, right? What did you leave behind you? What's coming? What did you leave behind you? So he said to them that Uqba and Shayba were killed, as well as Abu Jahl and Umayyah and Zam'at ibn al-Aswad and Nubay and Munabbih, as well as Abu al-Bakhtari ibn Hisham. And he began to name for them numerous nobles from Quraysh that were killed during the battle. So Safwan ibn Umayyah, right, Safwan, the son of Umayyah, one of his sons, he said, and he was sitting in the Hijr, right, that area of the Kaaba that wasn't enclosed by its walls when Quraysh rebuilt it, that Hijr, Ismail. And he was sitting in the Hijr, and he didn't believe the information. And he thought that Al-Husayman was inaccurate about what he was transmitting. So he said, Yani Safwan ibn Umayyah, while sitting in the Hijr, as if he couldn't be seen, he said, Wallahi in yaqil hadha. He said, I swear by Allah, this one doesn't have any sense. He doesn't know what he's talking about. So ask him about what happened to me during the battle, right? Even though Safwan was not there, he was trying to discredit this individual by saying, okay, ask him what happened to me. If his statements are truthful and honest, then, let's see him error and say such and such happened to me. And so they asked him, and they said to him, Ma fa'ala Safwan? What about Safwan? What happened to him? To which he replied, well, that's him sitting over there in the Hijr. And wallahi, I saw his father and his brother when they were killed. And so this was some information that reached him, that they had now begun to come to terms with the truthfulness of it. Adh-Dhahabi, he goes on, he says, وَأَنْ أَبِي رَافِعْ وَعَنْ أَبِي رَافِعْ مَوْلَى النَّبِي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال كنت غلاما للعباس وكان الإسلام قد دخلنا أهل البيت. He says, on the authority of Abi Rafi', who was the freed slave of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And this is in events to come. But Abu Rafi', the freed slave of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, I used to be a young boy who was owned by Al-Abbas. Abu Rafi', he said, I used to be a young boy who was owned by Al-Abbas. And as we know, Al-Abbas was at the battle. But the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam had said to the Sahaba to not allow any harm to come to Al-Abbas or any of the members of his family who had came out to the battlefield, because he knew that they did not want to participate in the battle, but that they were forced to go out. And we covered that story previously. But Al-Abbas was at the battle. And so this individual, Abu Rafi', he says, I was a young boy who was owned by Al-Abbas. And at this time, Islam had already entered amongst us, the family of the Prophet, right? At this time, Al-Abbas, it seems that he had already accepted Islam, although in secrecy. Al-Abbas, and this would have been the second year of after the Hijrah, it seems that he had already accepted Islam, although in secrecy. And so this is what Abu Rafi' is meaning when he says that Islam had already entered into the home of the family of the Prophet, right? His relatives, a lot of them had already accepted Islam, even if it be in secrecy. He says, فَأَسْلَمَ الْعَبَّاسُ وَأَسْلَمْتُ. And so because of this, Al-Abbas had already accepted Islam, as did I. So even though Al-Abbas was at the battlefield, he had already accepted Islam prior to that, even though he went out with the Quraysh to the Battle of Badr. And so Abu Rafi says, but Al-Abbas had already accepted Islam, as did I. وَكَانَ الْعَبَّاسُ يَهَابُ قَوْمَهُ وَيَكْرَهُ الْخِلَافَ وَيَكْتُمُ إِسْلَامَهُ. He says, and Al-Abbas used to be scared of his people. Right? If somebody asks, well, why did Abbas, who had accepted Islam, why would he go out with Quraysh? Why wouldn't he announce his Islam? Why would he be secretive about it? Abu Rafi, he tells us, he says, and Al-Abbas was one who was scared of his people, of his tribe, of his community. And this is something that can happen, right? A person can be shy or timid or awkward or afraid of maybe some of the repercussions that might come if they announce their Islam. And so this is Abu Rafi saying that Al-Abbas was one who was scared of his people, and he used to dislike opposing them. And so he concealed his Islam. He says, وَكَانَ ذَا مَالٍ كَثِيرٍ مُتَفَرِّقٍ فِي قَوْمِهِ. He says, giving another reason why Al-Abbas might have concealed his Islam, he said, and he was an individual who had a lot of wealth that was spread around amongst his people. Meaning a lot of people owed Al-Abbas money. And that money was with, numerous different individuals. So perhaps another reason to conceal his Islam was that he was worried that he might not be able to recoup the financial wealth that he had spread around to different individuals in the community. If he announced his Islam, they might take advantage. He would make hijrah. They would get away with not paying him back that which they owe him. And so he concealed his Islam, as we mentioned. Abu Rafi', he goes on to say, وَكَانَ أَبُو لَهَبٍ قَدْ تَخَلَّفَ عَنْ بَدْرٍ. Abu Lahab was somebody who did not participate in going to the Battle of Badr. We had talked about that earlier. Abu Lahab, being older in age, was somebody who sat down and did not go out and participate in the Battle of Badr. He says, فَلَمَّا جَاءَ الْخَبْرُ بِمَصَابِ قُرَيْشٍ كَبَتَهُ اللَّهُ وَأَخْزَاءَ. When the news of the defeat of Quraysh reached him, Abu Lahab, Allah subdued him, right? Kabatahu, debased him, lowered his status and his, the awe that he held in the people's eyes, and Allah disgraced him, right? This was the status of Abu Lahab after the Battle of Badr, is that Allah subdued him and lowered him in the eyes of the people and debased him, right? He says, وَوَجَدْنَا فِي أَنفُسِنَا قُوَّةً وَعِزَّةً. Abu Rafi', he says, and we found because of this, because of the defeat of Quraysh at the Battle of Badr, we found strength and honor amongst ourselves, those Muslims who were still weak and oppressed in Mecca. They found a sense of strength and pride. And this is something that's important, that the Muslim take pride and honor in those things that Allah does, where he blesses the Muslims with them in a general sense. That we as Muslims, we should be proud of our accomplishments as Muslims and the things that we have done in our history. And this is why it is one of the reasons why it's so important for us to learn about our history. Because in learning about our history, we'll see how much we as Muslims have contributed to the advancement of mankind and how much good Allah has placed in this earth by way of our hands. And it wasn't until we started leaving our religion and being ashamed of who we are in our religion and what it calls to, and compromising and appeasing the disbelievers, that disgrace and lowliness started to afflict us. Because if not, it wasn't more than 100, 200 years ago that we were the dominant. And it's been that way for a long time. And so it's important that we as Muslims, we, learn our history and take pride in our Salaf and those who came before us and the advancements and the accomplishments that they did, so that the next generation, those of us who are raised here in America, for example, and our children that are here, they can feel pride in their Muslim predecessors. And they don't have to feel that they need to change their name from Muhammad to Mo to fit in, or that they need to name their children Sarah or Sarah just so that they can get around without any disgrace. Because this was the Muslims in Mecca, after the news of the Battle of Badr had reached them. He said, we began to feel strength and honor amongst ourselves because of this victory. And Abu Rafi, he says, وَكُنْتُ رَجُلًا ضَعِيفًا وَكُنْتُ أَنْحَتُ الْأَقْدَاحَ فِي حُجْرَةِ زَمْزَمْ. Abu Rafi, he says, and I was a weak individual, right? He was a slave. He was somebody who was impoverished and weak and was not from the nobles of Quraysh. He said, and I was a weak individual, and I used to carve out cups in the room that in the room that was built around the well of Zamzam, right? The well of Zamzam, it used to have a room or a tent or something like that that would be set up over it. And so Abu Rafi, he would sit in that location. He would carve out cups, right? Chipping out of the stone or the wood to make cups. He says, فَإِنِّي لَجَالِسٌ أَنْحَتُ أَقْدَاحِ وَعِنْدِي أُمُّ الْفَضْلِ وَقَدْ سَرَّنَا الْخَبَرِ إِذْ أَقْبَلَ أَبُو لَهَبٍ يَجُرُّ رِجْلَيْهِ بِشَرٍ. He said, so I was sitting, in the room around the well of Zamzam, carving out my cups, and al-Fadl was with me. al-Fadl was the wife of al-Abbas, right? Al-Abbas, Abu al-Fadl, his wife was al-Fadl. And so this slave, Abu Rafi, he said that I was sitting carving out my cups, and with me was al-Fadl. وَقَدْ سَرَّنَا الْخَبَرِ. And we were delighted by the news that had reached us, right? Imagining them talking amongst themselves, rejoicing about the victory of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam over the kuffar of Quraysh, while they're living in Mecca, concealing their Islam and suppressed. He says, so that was the condition when Abu Lahab entered upon us, dragging his feet in an evil way, right? This, subhanAllah, the detail, the description. Imagine him depressed, grief-stricken, dragging his feet on the ground, not even having the strength to lift them off the dirt, as he is baffled and bewildered regarding the events that has happened to his people, and disgusted and dismayed by the victory of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he enters into this room where Abu Rafi and Fadl are, dragging his feet bishar, dragging his feet in an evil way, like scooting around. If you can imagine an individual walking gloomy, head down. حتى جلس على طنب الحجرة And he came until he sat upon the post of the room, right? The room, the tent that would have been set up around the well of Zamzam. It would have posts or pegs that would lock it down into the ground. And so he came into the room and he sat on one of those pegs. فَكَانَ ظَهْرُهُ إِلَى ظَهْرِي. And so imagine this big peg holding the room together, multiple pegs in the room. Abu Jahl sits on the peg, and Abu Rafi says, so his back was touching my back. Abu Rafi is sitting on the peg, carving out his cups, and Abu Jahl comes in and sits on the same peg, and now they're sitting back to back. He says, فَبَيْنَهُ وَجَالِسْ إِذْ قَالَ النَّاسِ هَذَا أَبُو سُفْيَانَ بْنُ الْحَارِثِ بْنِ عَبْدِ الْمُطَّلِبِ قَدْ قَدِمَ. So while he was sitting down, Abu Rafi says, while Abu Lahab was sitting, a person said, or the people said, this is Abu Sufyan ibn al-Harith ibn Abd al-Muttalib returning, right? Not Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, right? Not the leader of Quraysh at that time, but a different Abu Sufyan from the relatives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Abu Sufyan ibn al-Harith ibn Abd al-Muttalib, right? So he would have been the Prophet's cousin. And so when he returned, Abu Lahab, he said, فَقَالَ Abu Lahab إِلَيْهِ, right? Abu Lahab said to him, come to me, right? He directed him to come to him, فَعِنْدِكَ الْخَبَرِ, because you know what really happened, right? As the people are trickling in, returning from the battlefield, everybody wants to talk to people who might be more abreast about the situation, people that they can trust and get a better firsthand account of what occurred. So the news had reached the city, but as people are coming in, everybody is grabbing their individuals to tell them, well, what happened? What really happened? So Abu Lahab, he says to Abu Sufyan ibn al-Harith ibn Abd al-Muttalib, إِلَيَّ فَعِنْدِكَ الْخَبَرُ, come to me, because I know you know what really happened. Abu Rafi says, فَجَلَسَ إِلَيْهِ وَالنَّاسُ قِيَامٌ عَلَيْهِ. So Abu Sufyan, he sat in front of Abu Lahab, and the people were all standing around him, right? So this is Abu Lahab sitting on this wooden peg, or this peg of the tent or the room, this post in the room. And this is Abu Sufyan sitting in front of him, preparing to tell him the story. And the people have now crowded into this area to hear what's going on, and they're surrounding Abu Lahab and Abu Sufyan. And Abu Rafi is still sitting with his back to the back of Abu Lahab. And so Abu Rafi, he says, فَقَالَ يَبْنَ أَخِي. So Abu Lahab, he said to Abu Sufyan, oh my nephew, oh nephew, tell me, أخبرني كيف كان أمر الناس. Tell me what happened to the people. Tell me what happened to the people during the battle. What happened to Quraysh? How could they lose? 1,000 to 300? How could they lose? Tell me what happened. And so Abu Sufyan, he said, قال والله ما هو إلا أن لقينا القوم فمنحناهم أكتافنا يقتلوننا كيف شاءوا ويأسروننا. So Abu Sufyan, he said, Wallahi, there was nothing more except that we gifted them our necks or our shoulders, right? We lowered for them our heads like this, allowing them to kill us however they willed and take whoever they wanted as prisoners, right? He's criticizing his people and saying what happened was we weren't ready. We weren't prepared. We didn't have it that day. We went out there and it's like we just lowered our heads and allowed them to slaughter. Wallahi ma huwa illa an laqina al-qawm. We met that people, that group of people, and so we gifted them our shoulders, i.e. here, take your best shot, and we allowed them to kill us and imprison us however they saw fit. Abu Sufyan, he goes on to say, Waymullah, ma lumtun nas. But I swear by Allah, I'm not blaming the people, right? He's saying that this is what happened. We gave them our necks and allowed them to kill us and imprison us as they felt. But wallahi, it's not the people's fault. You can't blame Quraysh for what happened, right? Why does he feel that you can't blame Quraysh for what happened? He says, لَقِينَ رِجَالًا بِيضًا عَلَى خَيْلٍ بُلْقٍ بَيْنَ السَّمَاءِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاللَّهِ مَا تُلِيقُ شَيْئًا وَلَا يَقُومُ لَهَا شَيْءٍ. He says, indeed, we encountered men that were white in nature, clad in white, extremely white, in nature upon black and white horses between the sky and the earth, right? Flying, they're not on the ground, but they're in between the sky and the earth, coming down from the sky towards the earth. Nothing could hold them back, and nothing could oppose them. And this is him referring to the angels that Allah allowed to assist the Muslims in the Battle of Badr. So Abu Sufyan ibn al-Harith ibn Abdul Muttalib is telling them that we lost and we didn't put up any fight, but you can't blame us because he had the help of angels from Allah on his side. So when he told Abu Lahab this information, Abu Rafi, he goes on to say, قال Abu Rafi فرفعت طنب الحجرة بيدي. Abu Rafi says, so I lifted up the post with my own hands, meaning that post that they were sitting on, him and Abu Lahab, he gets up and he lifts it out the ground. He says, ثم قلت تلك والله الملائكة. He said, I said to him, wallahi, that was the angels. Right? So out of his excitement about this news and out of his joy for what happened to the Muslims, he can't hold himself back. Right? Remember, they were concealing their Islam, but he's told you now we're starting to feel a little strength. We're starting to feel a little bit of honor. And so his excitement, he forgets, perhaps you could imagine, his position amongst the people. And so it's like he snatches the chair from underneath Abu Lahab, right? They're sitting on that post. He stands up and he snatches it out the ground, right? So now Abu Lahab has to jump up. Everybody you could imagine is looking at him, and he announces, Wallahi tilka wallahi al-malaika. Those were, I swear by Allah, the angels. Abu Rafi, he says, فَرَفَ أَبُو لَهَبٍ يَدَهُ فَضَرَبَ وَجْهِي ضَرْبَةً شَدِيدًا. So when I did this, he says, Abu Lahab raised his hand and smacked me in my face with a strong blow, right? Imagine, he's still a slave, right? He's not one of the nobles of Quraysh. He's a weak individual. But out of his joy, he snatched this chair away from Abu Lahab, announcing that Allah was helping his messenger with angels, and to not be embarrassed and out of disgust about the circumstance and not appreciating the joy that somebody had at the defeat of Quraysh, Abu Lahab smacks him in the face, right? فَضَرَبَ وَجْهِي ضَرْبَةً شَدِيدًا. Like, oh, wallahi, these is why these stories are so interesting. So you imagine them and you put yourself in those situations. Abu Rafi', he said, I was a weak individual, but now the strength and the honor is entering into us because of this victory. We feel like, we can do anything. He says, so when he smacked me, thawartuhu, I jumped at him, right? I pounced at him. Allahu Akbar, right? This small, frail slave, after being smacked, pounces at Abu Lahab. He says, فَحَمَلَنِي. So he caught me, right? Imagine this individual. And he was a young boy too. Like, these are the things to remember, like these details. Kuntu ghulam. I was a young boy. He wasn't a shab, a young man. He wasn't an adult. He was just a young boy that this joy and this honor took him. He says, so I jumped at Abu Lahab. فَحَمَلَنِي. So he caught me. وَضَرَبَنِي. And he threw me to the ground. وَضَرَبَ بِيَ الْأَرْضِ. And he threw me to the ground, and then he knelt on top of me, striking me. ثُمَّ بَرَكَ عَلَيَّ يَضْرِبُنِي. Then he knelt on top of me, striking me. وَكُنْتُ رَجُلًا ضَعِيفًا. And I was a weak man, right? I was a weak person at that time. I wasn't strong, so there's nothing I could do about it, right? If you ever had a big brother or a big sibling, we remember when we would get picked on, they would sit on us and immobilize us, and we can't do anything. So he said, Abu Lahab caught me, threw me to the ground, and then knelt on top of me, striking me. And I was a weak person. He says, فَقَامَتْ أُمُّ الْفَضْلِ إِلَى عُمُودٍ مِّنْ عُمَدِ الْحُجْرَةِ فَأَخَذَتْهُ فَضَرَبَتْهُ بِهِ ضَرْبَةً. He says, so al-Fadl, right, Al-Abbas's wife, al-Fadl, she got up and took one of the pillars from the pillars that were holding up the room, right? Remember, they have this tent. They were sitting on the post, and it might also have pillars or something like that that are supporting it from, caving in. She took one of those pillars and she hit Abu Lahab with it with a strong blow. فَلَقَتْ فِي رَأْسِهِ شَجَّةً مُنْكَرَةً, and she caused in his head a severe gash, right? A very severe gash on his head. وَقَالَتْ اسْتَضْعَفْتَهُ أَنْ غَابَ سَيِّدَهُ. She said to Abu Lahab after she hit him, are you trying to pick on him? Istad'aftahu. You think he's weak because his master is absent, right? Al-Abbas was on the battlefield. And so here you are, Abu Lahab, trying to pick on your brother's slave because he's not here. Are you trying to pick on him because his master isn't here? He says, فَقَامَ مُوَلِّيًا ذَلِيلًا. Abu Lahab then got up and left in a state of disgrace, right? فَوَاللَّهِ مَا عَاشِ إِلَّا سَبْعَ لَيَالٍ. Abu Rafi, he says, I swear by Allah, he did not live more than 7 days or 7 nights after that. And so this is, like, you see the justice and the wisdom of Allah Azza wa Jal, how he defeated the Sanadid, the pillars of kufr in the battle of Badr, and how this individual, Abu Lahab, might have thought he was getting away, not being on the battlefield, but how Allah's predestination, the death that he was running from, caught up to him even in Mecca. He says, so I swear by Allah, he did not live anything more than 7 nights. حَتَّى رَمَاهُ اللَّهُ بِالْعَدَسَةِ فَقَتَلَتْهُ. He said he did not live more than 7 nights until Allah afflicted him with a disease known as al-adasa, which is where an individual gets like blisters or pimples, right, that are the size of like pox, like we might call it nowadays, blisters or bumps that are the size of those small adasa beans, and that caused him to die from them. So this is the death of Abu Lahab. So even though Abu Lahab wasn't in the battle of Badr, he died as a result of the battle of Badr. And like this, you found the leaders of kufr and the kuffar being wiped out in this battle. Adh-Dhahabi, he goes on, he says, وَكَانَتْ قُرَيْشْ تَتَّقِي هَذِهِ الْعَدَسَةِ كَمَا يُتَّقَى الطَّاعُونَ. He says that, Abu Rafi, he says that, and Quraysh, they used to protect themselves from this adasa, right? And if you want, you can imagine it as being something like smallpox, like chicken pox even, right? Some type of pox that a person would get sick and die from. He said in Quraysh, they used to protect themselves. They used to avoid this type of disease, this adasa, the same way an individual would avoid the plague, right? If somebody had this type of pox disease, then they would avoid it the same way they would avoid the plague. He says, حتى قال رجل من قريش لابني ويحكما أما تستحيان أن أباكما قد أنتن في بيته لا تدفنان فقال نخشى عدوى هذه القرحة فقال انطلقا فأنا أعينكما فوالله ما غسلوه إلا قذفا بالماء عليه من بعيد ثم احتملوه إلى أعلى مكة فأسندوه إلى جدار ثم رضموا عليه الحجارة. Subhanallah. Subhanallah. Look at how Allah compensates. Subhanallah. Look at how Allah compensates those who oppose his messenger. If you all remember, it was, if I'm not mistaken, it was Abu Lahab. Yes, it was Abu Lahab. Tabbat, right? And if I'm not mistaken, it was Abu Lahab who said to the Prophet, Innaka abtar, right? But it might have been Abu Jahl. So now I forgot, is it Abu Lahab or Abu Jahl who accused him or who attacked him by being abtar? Naam, Abu Lahab. Abu Lahab is the one who Surah Al-Kawthar was sent down about. because he criticized the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ for being abtar. And abtar, it means one who doesn't have any children, doesn't have any male descendants, right? His lineage is cut off. He doesn't have any family behind him. Look at how Allah compensated Abu Lahab. Abu Rafi says that Quraysh, they used to protect themselves from somebody with this pox the way that they would protect themselves from the plague. Meaning, if we found out that somebody had this pox, we would avoid him and shun him. And not only that, if somebody was caught mixing with them, we would avoid and shun them as well. He says, حَتَّى قَالَ رَجُلٌ مِّن قُرَيْشِ لِابْنَيْهِ. One of the people of Quraysh said to Abu Lahab's children, to his two sons, what's wrong with y'all? Are you all too shy? I mean, do you all have no shyness? Do you all have no shame? This is your father rotting in his house. Why don't you go bury him? Meaning, after Abu Lahab died, his own sons didn't want to have anything to do with his dead body. And so they left him and abandoned him in his home. Until somebody from Quraysh had to say to them, do you have no shame? Your father is rotting in his home. Why don't you go bury him? To which they responded, we're worried that this contagion will cause us wounds. Nakhsha adwata hadhihi al-qurha. We're worried about the contagion of this disease, right? We're worried that this disease is contagious and will afflict us. So that individual from Quraysh, he said, go, and I'll look out for the two of you all. In tariqa, فَأَنَا أَعْيُنُكُمَا. Go and take care of his body, and I'll keep an eye to make sure nobody sees what you're doing. Because as we mentioned, if the people saw what they were doing, they would probably boycott the two of them as well and abandon the two of them as well out of fear that they had been infected. So he said, go and bury your father, and I'll keep an eye out for the two of you. He says, فَوَاللَّهِ مَا غَسَّلُوهُ إِلَّا قَذْفًا بِالْمَاءِ عَلَيْهِ مِنْ بَعِيدٍ. Abu Rafi, he says, Wallahi, they did not wash his dead body, except that they threw water on him from far away, right? They didn't get close to his dead body. They just took buckets of water, handfuls of water, and just threw it on his dead body from far away. And then they carried him to the top of Mecca, right? To the mountain ranges, to the areas outside of Mecca in the high hills. And they leaned him up against a wall, and they threw stones against his body until he was completely covered, leaning against that wall. So like this was the burial of Abu Lahab, an individual who criticized the Prophet ﷺ of being abtar, having no children to take care of him. Like this, Allah compensated him by this is how his children took care of him after his death. And Allah consoled the Prophet ﷺ in that surah that we all know, Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar. Indeed, we have given you abundance, and that abundance is al-kawthar, that cistern or that hole, or that spring, that from it the water of the hole on the day of judgment. And he said, Inna shani'aka huwa al-abtar. Indeed, the one who criticizes you, he is the abtar. And so Allahu Akbar regarding the demise of Abu Lahab. We'll finish up. He says, وَرَوَاهُ Muhammad ibn Ishaq min طريق Yunus ibn Bukair عنه بمعنى. That Muhammad ibn Ishaq, he narrated this from the pathway of Yunus ibn Bukair on him, i.e. on Abu Rafi', with the similar meaning. قال حدثني الحسين بن عبد الله ابن عبيد الله ابن عباس and عكرمة and ابن عباس قال حدثني أبو رافع مولى النبي. Sorry, I said that backwards. Muhammad ibn Ishaq, he narrated this as is reported from the pathway of Yunus ibn Bukair. Yani Yunus ibn Bukair narrated on Muhammad ibn Ishaq. The meaning of this narration, so Muhammad ibn Ishaq, he said that Al-Husayn ibn Abdullah ibn Ubaydullah ibn Abbas narrated to me on the authority of Ikrimah, on the authority of Ibn Abbas, who said that Abu Rafi', the freed slave of the Prophet ﷺ, narrated to me, i.e. this story. adh-Dhahabi, he says, وروى عباد بن عبد الله بن الزبير عن أبيه أنه قال ناحت قريش على قتلاهم ثم قالوا لا تفعلوا فيبلغ محمدا صلى الله عليه وسلم وأصحابه فيشتموا بكم لا تشمت فيشمتوا بكم. He says that Abbad ibn Abdullah ibn Zubair reported that his father said Quraysh wailed over their dead, right? They would cry and scream and moan over their deceased until it was said, don't do so, right? Somebody amongst them finally said, you all have to stop crying and moaning over your dead, because that news will reach Muhammad and his companions and it will bring them joy, right? They'll be happy to see what has befallen you, right? It's natural for somebody to be happy about the harm that befalls their enemy, especially when their enemy took such delight in torturing and oppressing them. And so Quraysh, they used to tell themselves to not even cry or scream over your dead, which was a common practice amongst the Arab, because that news would reach Muhammad and it would bring them joy about how they conquered and defeated such evil individuals from Quraysh. He says, وَكَانَ الْأَسْوَدُ بْنُ الْمُطَّلِبِ قَدْ أُصِيبَ لَهُ ثَلَاثَةٌ مِّنْ وَلَدِ زمعة وعقيل والحارث فكان يحب أن يبكي عليهم. He said, and indeed the individual Al-Aswad ibn al-Muttalib, right? Al-Muttalib, the Prophet's grandfather's brother or great-grandfather's brother, Hashim's brother, had a son named Al-Aswad who had lost 3 sons in the battle, right? He had lost 3 sons in the battle. And he lost his son Zam'a ibn al-Aswad ibn al-Muttalib, as well as Aqil ibn al-Aswad ibn al-Muttalib, as well as Al-Harith. He had lost 3 sons during the Battle of Badr. فَكَانَ يُحِبُّ أَنْ يَبْكِي عَلَيْهِمْ. And so he preferred and he wished that he could cry over them, right? He wanted to still cry over them. Now, we'll stop at that amount, inshallah. Next time when we pick up, and hopefully next time we can we might finish this section. Maybe not, but next time when we pick up, we'll talk about what happened to the prisoners that were captured after the Battle of Badr, that were imprisoned by the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his companions, those captives. What was the outcome for them and what happened to them? So we'll stop at this amount. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على عبده ورسوله نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. Yes, Abu Lahab is the one who asked about what happened in the Battle of Badr. He didn't participate, and so they were getting news from those who came back. I don't know that he died due to the hit from Fadl. I don't know that he died from that. The narrator, Abu Rafi', says that he got a disease like pox, right? Smallpox, chicken pox, whatever this type of disease was during that time. They call it al-adasa, which are those small blisters and pox, those bumps that come onto the body that left untreated can cause death. And so that's what happened 7 days after he had gotten hit in the head by Fadl. As far as how he got buried, we mentioned that his sons, out of the fear of the contagion of that disease, they just washed his body by throwing water on him from far away. And then he was carried from their home to the high area of Mecca, leaned up against a wall, and rocks were thrown on top of him until they covered his body. So he wasn't even given the honor of being buried. He was just left on top of a high area where nobody could get to him, left up against the wall and covered in rocks above the ground. And that's very disgraceful. And that was by his own sons who treated him that way. due to what Allah had decreed of disgrace for him and what he had afflicted him with from that disease. As far as the book that we're reading, then as it says, it's Tariq al-Islam by adh-Dhahabi rahimahullah. The book is Tariq al-Islam by Al-Imam Abu Abdullah Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Uthman ibn Qayyamaz adh-Dhahabi rahimahullah ta'ala, who died in the year 748. No, his sons were not Muslims. His sons were not Muslims at that time, right? They were from the Kuffar of Quraysh at that time. The Sealed Nectar is a good book in English and in Arabic, and it's a summary, and it does similar to what adh-Dhahabi did, which is compiling all of this information from different sources. It's just that the Sealed Nectar is a book that is specifically about the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, while the book Tariq al-Islam, or the History of Islam, or the History of the Muslims, is a book that covers the history from the first year of our Islamic calendar, the Hijrah, all the way up until, if I'm not mistaken, year 709 is when adh-Dhahabi stopped recording. نعم وإياكم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.